All right, welcome to our mental health webinar. This is why your church needs mental health, a mental health champion. My name is Beth Golick from Key Ministry, and today I have the privilege of interviewing Catherine Boyle, who is Key Ministry's Director of Mental Health Ministry. So welcome. I'm happy to be able to chat with you for our audience today. I know you have a lot of great information to share.
Well, thanks.
So let's just kind of dive right into it.
Okay.
So the title of this is Why Your Church Needs a Mental Health Champion. So what exactly is a mental health champion?
Well, I'm glad you asked. And I just want to back up for a second and say this was something that I talked with Dr. Gersovich, our president and founder, 5 years ago. I mean, it was before I was on the Key Ministry team, and I kind of jokingly think that this is why he hired me, because it wasn't something he had come up with before. And so for those of you who know, Beth and I work on developing content for the ministry. And so when we were thinking about, well, what are some things that maybe we should be talking about this summer. So I actually had an opportunity to interview someone recently, and John Swinton himself, who was just like this revered theologian, was talking about the need for a church to have a mental health liaison or a champion. And I was like, yes, my little idea, it did have merit. So, so just a very basic definition is a mental health liaison or champion, whichever term you want to use, is really that person who's just responsible for overseeing mental health ministry in your church, whatever that ministry looks like, no matter how small or how big. So, if your church doesn't have official mental health ministry, well, that can be a person who, might be connected to your pastors or other ministry leaders who can say, I just think that this is something that maybe we just need to be a little bit more upfront about providing support for folks. So, the heart of it is really advocacy and just wanting to see the church come alongside people, no matter what their struggle or their issues might be.
So why would a church need this?
Well, I don't know how it is in your church. I know a little bit about your church because we work together and we talk together, and I've been to your church, but most churches just don't have the bandwidth to add really anything else. We all saw what COVID did to church responsibilities. It kind of turned things upside down and set a lot of things right side up.
Right.
Pandemic blessings.
Exactly.
But I think the initial response to any time you present a new idea to a pastor or ministry leader is, how much time is it going to take and how much is this going to cost? And then where are we going to get volunteers? But really, mental health ministry is very different in that regard, because it's not necessarily this big program of things. You're probably already doing a lot of things that are connected to or part of what an official mental health ministry looks like. So, this is a person who, is really that primary point of contact for your church after the pastors, to make sure that folks are getting, they're getting support for their mental health issues. Just as a quick little example, and this is one that is often used, but churches are like the best when it comes to things like, when you have a baby, when there's a death in the family, when somebody has a cancer diagnosis. You get that long line of casseroles down the street,
Right.
For any of those things. And gosh, you might actually get if you've got cancer or, something catastrophic that happens in your family, you might have like a whole team of volunteers that might help you for weeks or even months if it's something really significant. But the sad reality is that for many people, if their kid ends up in the psychiatric unit at the hospital, then it's not talked about, it's not prayed about, it's not loved on in any kind of tangible way. And all of those same needs, having the grass cut, getting kids to soccer practice,
The meal
Doing the work.
train, the,
Do it right. All those same needs exist if you
Mhm.
have a child in the psychiatric unit at the hospital for 2 weeks.
Mhm.
So that's why, particularly, if you've got a large church, there really does need to be a point person who can just kind of make sure that people with these kind of needs aren't being forgotten.
Mhm. Mhm. So I have another question for you, but I do want to first just take a little time out and point out to our attendees that they can actually chat with you using the chat feature that is on this webinar. So I encourage participants to click down on the chat button and just let us know where you're attending from today, where you're viewing from today. And also you can use that chat feature if you have any questions, and I'll make sure that I ask them of Catherine. Catherine, you mentioned that you said your churches may be doing some of these things already.
Right.
Can you give us some more examples of what some things that our churches may be doing that we didn't even realize kind of fall under that umbrella of
Right.
the mental health umbrella?
Yeah, and when I say that, like, the mental health ministry advocate, champion, liaison, whatever you want to call this person, oversees what I'm going to describe in a second, that doesn't mean they're in charge. It just means that, for example, your prayer and care team,
Mhm.
that they are praying for people's mental health needs, that people are becoming more comfortable sharing mental health needs, and those things aren't being gossiped about,
Mhm.
but they're being actually prayed for in a thoughtful and meaningful and loving way, and then followed up on, as would any other kinds of needs that are presented to the prayer and care team. If you are in a church that really looks to do outreach in your community, meeting local community needs, well, kind of diving in to understand what those needs are, and looking at things that are very stressful for families. Those things can easily lead to depression and family breakdown, those kinds of things. Those all have a mental health component to them. So just making sure that those kinds of things are being thought through and developed with kind of a mental health lens to them as well. But then even things like small group ministry. Small groups are really where, in my experience and what I've observed in a lot of other churches, that can become like your spiritual family. And that's where a lot of hands and feet of Christ kind of ministry should be taking place. Because, I mean, let's face it, the pastors cannot provide that kind of one-on-one care to every single person. How unhealthy would that be for the pastor, right? So these are things that your church is probably already doing.
Right.
And then even just things like your communications, without being over the top on making sure that, you're the way that you're communicating is, it's not about not being offensive. It's just about being thoughtful about how you describe things. I mean, how bad would it be to stand up and describe somebody with a physical disability, is like a punchline to your joke in a church setting? Well, then that shouldn't be, don't use people who have schizophrenia, for example,
Right.
or bipolar disorder as the punchlines to your jokes either, in your messages, or certainly not in other kinds of communications.
Right.
So does that make sense?
That does make sense. So what I'm hearing is that this person isn't in charge of all these things,
No.
but is the liaison, thus the word liaison,
Right.
to some of these existing,
Yes.
either whatever your church culture is or
Yes.
programs, whatever, but is making sure that there's this inclusion of the mental health ministry in every area of your church.
Yep.
So what might this person look like? Do they need to be a doctor? Do they need to be a mental health professional?
Well, I mean, that's certainly a possibility, but I don't consider that a requirement at all. I mean, I think really it should be somebody who has a heart for this ministry. You probably want somebody who, I mean, quite honestly, most people who end up in disability ministry of any kind, or mental health ministry, kind of and or there, have some sort of personal connection to that ministry, whether they have had, lived experience with a mental health need or, have a family member. So, people that have those kinds of experiences, those people often are the most passionate, and therefore, probably, you should look for somebody who falls into that category. Actually, when I was starting mental health ministry, before I was on the Key Ministry team, my church was already praying about it and, being more deliberate about it, which was really just a cool affirmation. It's like I called up our executive pastor and wanted to have a meeting with him. And he said, yeah, yesterday in our staff meeting, we were actually talking about how we need this. Mm-hmm. And so I was just like, thank you, Lord. But then I went on to learn that, that particular person, grew up with an alcoholic parent. Mm-hmm. And, those kinds of things are often self-medicating behaviors at their heart for, an undiagnosed mental health need. So, that kind of experience leads to a passion that will never go away, mm-hmm. is what I'm trying to say. So, so maybe that's a mental health professional in your church, maybe not, but you want somebody who can be a self-starter, who's organized, and gets the need for mm-hmm. mental health ministry, it just from a spiritual perspective, and it really is a spiritually mature person, who's not going to be the one cracking the inappropriate jokes at somebody's expense, who's right there. And you want somebody, it doesn't have to be the person who is in charge of, committees or your kids ministry or your men's ministry or anything like that, but it's somebody who's been there for a while, that a lot of people know, and that, that people are going to feel comfortable talking with about not necessarily their deepest, darkest secrets, but just, that other people will recognize that this is a serious person. So, and that they're going to make sure that, people are going to get their needs met.
Yeah. So, so what I'm hearing is there's not like a specific degree necessarily that a person has to have, but it's
That's
really
right.
The heart and the passion. And I'll just read a comment that's in the chat. Well said. One who has experience often has the greatest passion. That's right. So thank you, Julie, for sharing that. Also over in the chat, so we have an attendee from Ottawa, Ontario. So welcome. And I encourage everybody to share where they're from. We'll keep calling those out while we're talking. So this sounds like a really important role for someone to have at the church. So is this, does this have to be a paid staff person? Because you actually kind of opened up this talk today talking about how churches might be like, not sure that we've got that in the budget at the moment.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know how it is for your church, or for the churches of the folks on the call, but most churches don't have just like ready cash to be able to bring on a new staff person. And so, but I don't think that's a hindrance necessarily, because if you do have somebody who has that kind of passion and wants to see some change, I was that person. Mm-hmm. And, so, there are people in your community that probably have some experience and passion about this, who don't maybe mind spending what their energy and what their time is that they would normally be giving to the church anyway, to be focusing it in this direction. So, but your church has to make that decision as to whether or not it's something that you want to pay people to do. There's pros and cons with both. There's definitely, you have to think about the whole issue of, who does the person report to, and, and job descriptions and all of that kind of stuff, if it's a more formal, position. And, this is a kind of ministry that may get pushback anyway, so it might be a much harder sell for your congregation. We know just in the disability inclusion ministry world, that there's often pushback there just because of concerns about time and expense. So, I mean, you have the same kinds of issues with mental health ministry that, there may be a need to actually persuade the staff that this is something that is necessary. So if it comes with a price tag, it's probably going to be a much harder sell.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, people who are, maybe a little older, maybe have a little bit of time on their hands, look, think about those kinds of people to be good candidates for this role.
So in your experience, have you seen both models? Have you seen the volunteer role and you've seen this as a paid staff position?
Well, so some of the churches that we've worked with in the last couple of years, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head really of any churches that have anything on their website that says mental health liaison, mental health champion, mental health coordinator. So my guess is that the answer is really not directly, but they're folding it under something else.
Okay.
So we're connected with Prestonwood Church in Dallas, and that's a huge church. They've got a lot of things going on. Pastor Jack Graham is very committed to mental health ministry. Michael Perrin is the gentleman who's in charge of life recovery. And he seems to me like the person who's probably filling that role at that church. So you may already have somebody like that that's in your church, but they just might not have that official name tag on their hat.
Okay.
But it never hurts to more formally identify somebody in that way, because that can really facilitate whatever ministry goals you kind of set forth for people, and to help people just be that much more encouraged to step forward and get help when they need it.
Okay. That makes sense. So, and it kind of leads to my next question, but before I do that, I want to give a shout out to Los Angeles, who is joining us on the webinar today. So again, please share where you're from. We'll keep shouting those out. So regarding kind of the whole job description and all that, would this person do counseling and meet with people? Isn't that the pastor's job?
Well,
more about that.
Not necessarily. And, obviously if the person has a counseling background, that's a different issue. But, statistics say that about 25% of people still go to their pastor first when they have a mental health need, because it can be very difficult to determine, if it is a mental health need or if it's really a spiritual need. And honestly, when you have mental health issues, you have spiritual questions. I mean, it's just kind of a natural byproduct. So no, I mean, the short answer is no. The mental health liaison is not going to be doing pastoral type counseling, but they may be the person who is the first point of contact on mental health issues in your church once it becomes known that this is a role that is available in your church. Of course, if you don't start telling people or have this on your website, then nobody's going to know. Right. So, the person can be the first point of contact for somebody who's within your church or outside your church. This will be the person who is the primary advocate for mental health type needs in your church, making sure they get to be included in the prayer and care team, making sure that needs within your church or your community are being addressed as part of the outreach efforts. And then also, I mean, kind of an interesting thing we've learned the last couple of years within Key Ministry is that even for mental health providers who aren't necessarily faith-based, a lot of times when they're working with their patients or their clients, whatever their mental health practice is, the client will express something about, I really would like, a faith community that supports me. So there are probably providers in your area who would like to know that your church can walk beside somebody who's having these struggles. So, the mental health liaison or champion can be that point of contact for the local mental health community as well, to not only send referrals from the church to the providers, but from the providers to the church.
So you've hit on a couple of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm just going to shout them out. You did say having some kind of mention of this on the church's website, because that's the thing I like to talk about is having that information on the website. And secondly, you talked about working with organizations or, in this case, maybe counseling offices in the community. So I love the idea of the church partnering with the community. So
Yes.
thanks for
Yes.
hitting two of my favorite topics.
Yes.
I want to head over to the chat for a second because we've got a lot going on. So welcome Lynchburg, Virginia and Fort Wayne, Indiana. Also, there's been a request for your contact information. So let me take this opportunity to say this webinar is from Key Ministry, so keyministry.org. And we have a whole page and page of resources and links to resources. So I'm going to ask you about that, Catherine, but I also want to say there's a comment in here that the viewer is very pleased that this topic is being addressed. Mental health ministry is as important as physical health ministry.
Yes.
And that she too has been working to enlarge the footprint of mental health ministry within churches. So that's awesome. And so can we shift gears just for a second, Catherine, and talk a little bit about what Key Ministry has to offer as far as resources and how people can access those?
Sure. Well, if you go to our website that Beth just mentioned, keyministry.org, we have a whole drop-down menu. It's called mental health at the top search bar across the top of the website. And we have a network of churches where if you're a church that's doing mental health ministry, you can add your church to that database so people can find you. We've got many hundreds of blog articles on a variety of topics, from very detailed medical type information from Dr. Gersovich, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and then also the spiritual impacts of mental health issues. So the whole gambit, from both perspectives. Hundreds of blog articles there. We've got other resources. There are books by excellent Christian writers, including Dr. Gersovich's book, Mental Health in the Church. So, lots of information there. And we provide free counseling or consulting, I should say, to churches and ministry leaders. So feel free to just email me, Catherine@keyministry.org. I'm Catherine with a C. And we'll be happy to have a conversation about specifically what your needs are or what you're looking for. And we provide this service free of charge. Anything I miss? Well, we also have lots of webinars like this, and we have and other video trainings. So, but again, all that's right there.
Yeah, so I think my recommendation would be for folks to first go to keyministry.org and click on the mental health ministry tab and check out some of these resources that Catherine just mentioned, including the mental health webinars like the one we're on right now. We have a really good one coming up next month as well. And then also you can set up an appointment with Catherine, to talk through maybe some specific resources that perhaps we can help you out with. So yeah, I think that's good. Hopefully that covers it. So what would you say is the overall goal for the position of mental health champion, mental health liaison, mental health advocate?
Well, it is absolutely not to create a whole bunch of stuff and programs. Okay. We all can do programs. Okay. But can we ever? But it's really about making a cultural change or a mindset change. And that is a much harder job. And it's harder to measure. But you will see that it's happening when people are talking more freely about their mental health needs, when they're coming forward sooner, when they know they have mental health needs. I mean, right now, the average time from onset of symptoms until somebody gets the appropriate help is 5 to 7 years.
Wow.
That is a really long time, particularly, if it's something that is preventing you from functioning in a normal and healthy way, which mental illness often does. So, to the extent that churches can help create some dialogues, just help people understand that this is part of the human condition, Shame is kind of inherent in mental health issues. It doesn't mean that you are a worse human being than anybody else because you're depressed. To the extent that churches can help change that perspective, that's going to end up having, a very positive impact on a lot of lives.
Mhm.
So, so that's the job.
Okay. So I suspect that we may have some viewers, either live right now or watching the recording later, that are kind of feeling that little nudge right now. And they may be saying, wow, maybe I'm being called to do this. So tell me a little bit about how they might get started in this role and what kind of time commitment maybe it might take.
Absolutely. Well, a couple of things. So on our website, we have a step-by-step guide on getting started with mental health ministry in your church. And so just another little shout out for our website, keyministry.org. Just click on that mental health tab and there's a link that says get started. And really the most important thing to get started with is to get the support of your church leadership. If a person is in ministry leadership and they have not had direct experience, either themselves, their family, or, within, people coming forward in the church community, they may not be aware of the pervasiveness because people don't want to talk about things like this. So, educating and getting the people in leadership to really understand the significance and the size of the issue is the most important thing. But then after that, just some of the things that a mental health ministry champion or liaison might be doing is, they might be connecting with, for example, there are local mental health boards where I live who provide free mental health first aid training. That might be something that is really helpful and eye-opening for all of your ministry leaders to take. They'll come right to your church and teach that free of charge. So, that's the person, the mental health liaison might do that coordination of getting that set up and getting people registered for that. The liaison might actually, start gathering information on what the local community mental health resources are. Your church may already have the referral list to a few counselors, but that's probably not the extent of what people really need. So, that champion or liaison can really figure out, a much more, robust assortment of resources that are available in your community. Again, talking about collaboration, that's a really important aspect of the liaison's job. So, being willing to just reach out and have those conversations with folks who are professionals in the community. And I would just encourage any church leader who's listening to this or thinking about this, you probably already have people within your faith community who are in the mental health community. They're counselors, therapists, they're doing some kind of mental health work and they're right there. So get to know those folks, get to know them a little bit personally and let them make the introductions. You don't have to necessarily seek out, these relationships with no previous contact. Things will go a lot smoother and faster if you kind of leverage what you already have. A wise person once said to me many years ago that when God calls you to do something, he's usually provided you with all the resources you need right around where you are just to get started. Not everything for your whole journey, the whole thing he's calling you to, but to get started. And so seriously, look at who's already part of your church. And then, there's lots of other things that can be done in terms of like trying to figure out what the unmet needs are in your community and how your church might come alongside and help. But I'm fortunate to live in an area where there's some really great nonprofit orgs that are doing social services kind of work in my area. And most of those agencies produce reports every year or two that are, public information. You can just glean so much for that's appropriate and important for churches to be paying attention to and areas where they can step into ministry, like if there's no good before and after care, school kinds of, help. I mean, that's obviously requires volunteers to provide, but I mean, goodness, that's a giant life stress for a lot of parents, particularly, lower income families or people who are single parents. I mean, what a great blessing to provide reliable, safe childcare, before and after school that can really just make a world of difference.
Right.
So anyway.
Another thing that you actually mentioned earlier, but I'm going to mention it again. But
Yep.
as we kind of think about, how does somebody get started in this role, or how do we implement this at our church? And you said it so beautifully earlier when you were talking about the ministry that you started at your church. Really take it to prayer. It's so important to pray that God goes before us in all this and opens those doors, closes the doors that shouldn't be open. So that's a really important piece as well.
Well, and I would just say too, I mean, we've all had to do so many things in the past year and a half that we've never had to do. And, a lot of churches are really reevaluating how they do things. And we're going to be talking about that next month. But this is a great time to really be thinking about, are we approaching mental health ministry in a holistic way that makes sense? So don't feel like you're behind the 8 ball, or, you've got a lot of catching up to do. I mean, we were so delighted last year with all of the, the challenges that the pandemic presented to the church world, that, that so many pastors and churches were talking about the realities of being anxious and depression and stress for the very first time. And so, this is a great time to just leverage, what we have all been through, to try to expand this so that your church can really become that place of refuge for folks who are walking through mental health needs.
Yeah, I know the Meekins are watching, and I know they know what I'm going to say next, but pandemic blessings.
That's right.
Right. Okay. So Catherine, in case this is like a brand new topic for some people, can you just give us an idea of, when you're talking about mental health conditions, like what are can you throw out some of the mental health conditions that are really obstacles for people to do church, to attend church? What?
Yep. Well, so when we're talking about, let's talk about adults for a second, and then we can talk a little bit about kids. So for adults, depression, anxiety, I think most of us felt anxious last year, but some people really deal with anxiety that is pretty crippling in terms of their, social relationships. I've done a presentation a couple of times for Key Ministry from this young lady who has high functioning autism, and she also obviously has a lot of anxiety, which is not uncommon. And how she talks about going into church, and it's, all those basically cheerful people that want to pounce on her, and how awful, she thinks that is. And, for somebody who doesn't live with that, that just sounds like such a strange concept. Well, the liaison, the champion, can be that person that can meet with this person who lives with this crippling anxiety but wants to be part of a faith community, and meets with them during the week. I'm at my church right now. There is nobody here. It's camp week for our youth. And I mean, so there's like 2 people in the office. And so this is a perfect time for that person with anxiety to come walk through the church with the champion and look at what the layout is, and get a little degree of comfort, and see, all right, here's an entrance where nobody really comes and goes. I can come in that entrance and there won't be perky people pouncing on me.
Right.
Okay. And anyway, so I mean, that's one example. Let's just say for adults. For kids, Dr. Gersovich has written a lot of articles about what mental health impacts are on religious participation. There's been some great studies, like out of Clemson University, that have looked at that. And it's not the physical disabilities, the things that we can see, that are the ones that tend to keep families out of churches, it's really the mental health disabilities. And for kids, let's just use something like ADHD. I mean, like the kid who can't sit still, you know, that kid isn't necessarily being a bad kid because they're really having a hard time sitting still. So, you know, as Beth is a KidMin guru, I mean, you know that, you know, if you can keep that kid active while they're listening and learning, they're probably going to absorb a lot. And so the liaison can make sure that the KidMin team is really understanding or seeking to understand that, you know, that isn't necessarily a bad kid.
Right.
It's a kid that's having a hard time. And let's try to understand, you know, what is hard for the kid in that environment. And how can we come alongside to help the kids succeed?
Yeah, and I'll put in a little plug for Key Ministry here, but you know, we can help you work through like that particular KidMin situation. So we can help you with resources and how you can equip your volunteers to welcome kids with all different kinds of, like, with learning differences, and you know, how those manifest themselves in the classroom. So give us a shout out, or give us a click on our website and we'll talk to you about that. So this has been incredible. And I'm sure there are people now that are like, okay, we need to do this. But what happens when the church isn't just coming alongside you with this, the idea of embracing mental health ministry? What if they're not supportive?
Well, I mean, that is, you know, I mean, like anything in this world, you know, you're going to get pushback and objections, and, you know, I get that. But oftentimes when people object to things, it's because they do not understand, or they're speaking from a place of fear. And, you know, I'll never forget, I was having, or let me add kind of a third thing to that, or they may think that it's a lot bigger than it really is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'll never forget, I was having this meeting before I knew Dr. Gersovich, and was meeting with this pastor locally. I spent a lot of time just meeting people locally, trying to understand, connect, collaborate, the whole works that we do in Key Ministry too. And I mean, this pastor has a very influential ministry, and I was talking about, you know, my goals for mental health ministry, and this person said, it's just too hard. And I thought, wow. I don't know what the pastor was actually thinking how the pastor defined the it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But let's define the it for your church. Okay. The it for most churches is not going to be healing somebody's schizophrenia. Okay. It is not going to be excusing every behavior that a person wants to do. You know, it's not about excusing lying, stealing, murder. You know, it's not about excusing sin, but it is about understanding, you know, what's going on with a person, being honest. You know, we can't know, we can't be free in Christ unless we know the truth about God's word. I mean, we can't really be free to address the illness aspect of mental health issues unless we know what's going on. You have to know the truth to be able to treat it correctly. And so when those objections come, you know, it's important to just respond with facts about mental health needs, that 1 in 5 people everywhere you go has a mental health diagnosis. That, you know, there are many instances in scripture that appear certainly to be describing depression, anxiety, and maybe even worse, definitely OCD. Martin Luther famously knew that he had depression and anxiety, and most definitely OCD. He had a name for it that I can't remember, but it's a German word. And, you know, and it was really kind of crippling for him. But I think that, you know, we would probably say that God worked through those things in his life.
Absolutely.
So, the important thing is really to understand that, just like you would never describe somebody who has cancer as cancer, you value the dignity and the image of God in that person who is living with cancer. You value the image and the dignity of the person who has bipolar disorder. And when you can talk factually about mental health issues and help people see what can be done, just little baby steps. When people start to see what can be done, then, oh my gosh, I mean, it's just like the light bulbs start going off and you start seeing more and more, people realize that, yeah, I can come alongside that friend who's really struggling with depression, and I can reach out. And now that I know how hard it is to initiate conversations, friendships, what have you, when a person is really depressed, I'll be more patient with that person who hasn't returned my phone call. So, it's mental health issues are absolutely part of the human condition. They always have been.
Right.
And I'm confident they always will be until Jesus comes back. So, it can be, your church can really make an enormous difference in individual lives and in the lives of your community by getting that reputation for being a refuge for folks who have mental health needs.
All right. I think that's a great way to end it. I mean, this is just, as was pointed out in the chat earlier, I mean, this is just such an important topic and something that our churches need to address. So thank you, Catherine, for filling us in on this particular role. And I hope that everybody that has watched today kind of inventorying like what their churches are currently doing and what role they might play in that mental health ministry inclusion piece. Are there any parting words you want to leave us with or assignments you want to give us?
Well, I would just encourage, anybody who has any kind of question, who's watching this either live or, when this is recorded video, to just feel free to reach out to me, Catherine at keyministry.org, Catherine with a C. This is what we do all the time is, talk with churches and church leaders and, answer questions and help them think through options. Your church doesn't have to have this role, but the bigger your church gets, the more disconnected people are from one another. It probably is a good idea to have somebody really thinking about this through the lens of a person who has a mental health need. And I would just encourage you, if you've heard all this and you've got that nudge, like Beth said, to just pray about it. I mean, God will make it so clear to you. I mentioned earlier that when I got started in mental health ministry, I reached out to our executive pastor, and just the day before, the church staff had been praying about starting mental health ministry, and they didn't know exactly what to do. And, everybody who's followed Christ for a long time has got little stories like that, but, he's waiting to write that kind of story in your life too. So don't be afraid to take that step. And Beth and I and Dr. G are always here to help you if you have questions along the way.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. And thanks everybody for joining in, and check out keyministry.org. Click on our events page so you can sign up for the next webinar we have.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Beth.